Dear colleagues, through these 2 days of the conference, one of the concerns expressed was how are we going to understand and explain the April-May events in Armenia. Hopefully this presentation will somehow help you to answer that important question. Before I get down to the text per se, this is more a result of something, the compilation in translation of the feminist papers of the 80s and discussions that unfolded there. The questions and solutions set forth here shall evolve around provisions that had either been criticized or are not used like before, but understanding that, I still find it expedient to rely on this pre-science and provisions, hoping that they will shed some light on the subject. This is rather focusing on some possible solutions. It would be appropriate to first formulate the scope of issues which will pave the way for properly raising the subject, which are: is it at all possible, on the basis of the so-called Western experience, to compile theories, principles, and methods? Could they also apply when studying non-Western experiences? If yes, how shall these be applied? Is there an essential need to develop strategies for their application, considering the fundamental Westernist and non-Western divide? These issues are not new. They became more salient in the colonial, post-colonial, non-Western societies, where in various academic circles, in both Western and non-Western, they tried to make this a subject of study. Moreover, the first question posed here greatly determined the sciences on history, culture, and humanities. The social sciences should have been studied mostly and predominantly by Western societies embarking on the age of modernity, and the humanities, and especially anthropology, by the non-Westerns who still had not embarked on that stage. These issues became more salient and expedient in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Western research models penetrating the post-Soviet societies, including relevant institutions in Armenia. It should be mentioned that I'm not talking at all about the models based on Western experience not being used in Soviet institutions before. Of course, the social sciences and humanities in the Soviet context were based on Western practices, but there were very limited Western theories, ideas, and hypotheses in circulation. Some of them were even prohibited in the Soviet context, and the Soviet sociological thought was underdeveloped in general. The Soviet didn't have a full-fledged study of its own society. It didn't have adequate empirical, neither theoretical toolkits to study it. That which the post-Soviet social realities entailed to be studied. There was a certain divide between the available toolkit and the object to be studied, which had to result in statements of impossibilities to study it. This divide, this schism, intermittently became apparent in the continually unfolding changes concurrent thereto. I'm talking in particular also about the Armenian events that were qualified as a Velvet Revolution. So one had to decide how to deal, after all, with the Armenian social reality from research perspective. For a local researcher, first and foremost, it became essential to acquire cognizance of this divide and try to find a way out from it if this divide was inevitable and the local academic practice were to be deemed immature and yet not fertile, what could have been the possible solutions if these issues were not at all new for the non-Western societies? Could their experiences propose certain strategies in given context? These two questions may be answered positively by identifying two such strategies which were inspired by post-constructivist schools. The first strategy, if it was efficiently applied by Chakravarti Spivak in his thoughts on the sacrifice of the widow. Although Spivak never names it, I would propose to name it at least quasification of certain actual references. The second strategy was more inspired by Paul Gidro's liberation from Western slavery and could be qualified as a selective application of this instrument. The post-colonial feminist cultural studies have made it already classical. Made a subordinate speak thoughts on the sacrifice of the widow was written in the 80s of the last century. The focus of the ideas of the author is the right of burning the widow fire. He brings forth two contrasting but mutually legitimizing approaches: the British imperial and the Indian native. But the remarkable part in this essay is not only the entire, not the idea of shedding light on the ritual of silencing the widow, but the approach he adopts. The essay is written in a critical spirit, which sometimes even turns into sarcasm, but it's also permeated by pointed self-criticism. So a question arises: what makes the author throughout the essay to maintain this self-critical spirit? One of the decisive circumstances, I believe, is the existing cultural, political, radical difference between the subject studied and the researcher, which is increasing the possibility of unreliability of acquired knowledge, therefore puts a big question on the expediency and appropriateness of doing such a research within the confines of the Western thought. On the other hand, one has also to accept that by the end of the day, in the academic discourse, there are no practices that would be alternative to Western ones. In this case, you could have highlighted the silence of a subjective woman, whereas he wants first and foremost to give her a voice, because in no previous attempt, I'm talking 70s and 80s, of Indian history, the voice of this subject woman was never heard. So he has adopted Western practices, applying, like he says, the first world, Freud, Foucault, and Lyotard, and others, male-dominated viewpoints, but emphasizing all the time that in referencing to the Freud's reflection, this is being done only conventionally. So in the mind of Spivak, there is already the predisposition to discuss the local reality in the light of and in with references to Western practices. In other words, in applying these theories and references, the Spivak applies or adopts a strategy which may be conventionally called quasification. So these theories and references to some extent lose their accuracy and reliability, which is eroded, and this characteristic about erosion of accuracy and reliability is more characterized from a Western viewpoint or perspective. Instead, Suddenly, there is a better outline and more salient. We see features that would have been unnoticed otherwise. So you can objectify the heretofore unobjectifiable structures, relations, and alia. So even through by paying the price of codification of references within the framework of Western practices, it is becoming possible to study the non-Western realities. In general terms, Martin Heidegger's ideology impact is felt here, which constructivist thinkers like Judith Butler and Ernesto Lacmalde their teachings have been significantly affected by this. In the event of the latter, the cosification is just one of the orientations that give birth to thought. Does this cosification in its turn become inevitable? And like, and how could it be explained at all? I think this is also an important question, or this series of questions. In the first case, the answer is also positive, determined by the fact that theories and references upon being transferred from one cultural context to another, contexts that are especially at a significant distance from each other, is nothing else but an act of translation. And as it is common knowledge, no translation can ever be ideally reproducing or transposing the work into a different cultural context. It inevitably transforms, as like Benjamin would say, Walter Benjamin. The original survives, continues to live, and relive in another language. So the codification of references is not only inevitable, but is absolutely not to be feared in the academic sense. Moreover, it is fruitful, especially in the context of Western practices, as a way to renovation, innovation, and transgressing the confines. Especially Judith Butler from Among the Constructivism realizes this. Who and one can draw this conclusion from her thoughts about translation practices. I will now apply both approaches specifically to the Armenian realities, like I attempted to do. As I mentioned, it's first and foremost inspired by Paul Gilroy's The Black Experience of Shedding Slavery, and may be used the selective application of Western research methods. Famous literary critic, post-colonial thinker Paul Gilroy, in his Black Atlantis and famous work, examines a culture, like he calls it the Black Atlantis, which transgresses ethnicity or nation and includes African American, Caribbean, or British cultural elements. At the same time, juxtaposing the holistic approach of portraying the reality as a monolith, he adopts an opposing approach, taking it as a reality replete with internal diversity. Paul Gilroy says that from slavery to the ideology of Western approaches to liberation from slavery is applied selectively. It should not be looked at as something absolutely outside of Western modernity, but it could be viewed even within the Western modernity, which puts the relations between the West and the slave. So, within the operating within the framework of Western practices, often that which the researcher does or can do in the event of the non-Western experience is nothing else but the selective application of Western approaches and theories in addressing a local issue and resolving it. Sometimes it is necessary to combine various components from these theories, letting go of some other components thereof. So thus the above mentioned two strategies are charting an interesting relationship between the Western and non-Western, the exogenous and the internal, the general and the specific. For example, if we take the liberty of making a vulnerable assumption which is in circulation, which looks on the one and at the Western, exogenous and general, on the other hand, the non-Western, internal and specific. This especially pertains to the position, means, and results of a study and the reliability of the findings. It would be appropriate now to reflect on the two strategies of classification of references and selective application. As is common knowledge in the public discourse, in the Armenian public discourse, there is a widely circulated idea, among others, the idea and the notion of historical injustice. So we had to find the means of research which would allow us to look at the Armenian discourse reality and the role and place of this idea in that reality. As such, I have selected a post-Marxist study with its tradition in the post-constructive Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe works. In this study, the actual references are the point of node, and the Laclau and Zizek have borrowed it from Jean Lacan and enriched it through their approach. And the idea of hegemony was taken from Antonio Gramsci. In a nutshell, in this theory, the framework of discourse in its meanings is not enshrined essentially. Therefore, there are floating denominators. But that which concurrently describes the framework is the surplus of meanings. When the hegemony is affirmed in discourse through its point of application or nodes, where they are temporarily and partially enshrined in the elements of the floating denominators of that framework, thus acquiring a regulatory role. So if the notion historical injustice is perceived as such a node, you clearly outline the hegemony that is characteristic of Armenian reality, the neoliberalism and conservatism in certain combination thereof. But the issue was that in the Armenian reality, it would be difficult to describe it as a reality endowed with the surplus of meanings, which is still preserved and salient in the most recent events, which were described as Velvet Revolution. On the other hand, denying any ideological or ideographic alternatives in the Armenian reality would also be impossible. So here's the dilemma: either let go of this theory which allows to describe this reality, or at least apply such just any strategy in theoretical discourse. If this post-Marxist theories, both actual hegemony and node notions, were to be quasified, that is, applied with reservations, that is, conventionally, reducing the degree of their accuracy to some extent, every condition to their application seems to exist. On the one hand, it would be possible to work within the four corners of Western practices. On the other hand, acquire knowledge that would characterize the Armenian reality, but the reliability, margin, and accuracy of this through self-criticism may be maintained to a certain degree. The, the events that were called Armenian Velvet Revolution could also be studied, did lend themselves to study under the angle of this theory. If the famous motto, take a step and turn down surge, could be qualified as a partial denominator and contains within all other popular demands like increased wages, for example, or fight against corruption, then it's also understandable why it was possible to have such a radical uh, break. But in the event of the lack or scarcity of ideological nominators. Such a hegemonic notion applies with certain reservations. Now let's reflect on the second application of this strategy. As for the second strategy, the example will be shorter because in reality, separate communication keynote would be required for that. This could be called liberation, but not yet a full revolution in the meaning of Arendt theory. Focusing on issues of social justice, which is John Rawls's theory, and in the post-Marxist sense, this could be deemed as a, and for Hall's theory, the pivotal well-regulated society is a notion that in this case, I believe it does not apply. Of course, one of the main questions is what transpires when a researcher applies often divergent theories and studies from modernist to postmodernist, from to post-Marxist. The answer is in the spirit of post-constructivism. In this reality, everything resembles ethical political decision making.